Welcome back to Half Past Capitalism, where we talk about alternatives to capitalism as if they were possible. This show is part of the Harbinger Media Network. And our guest today is Justin Podur, a longtime comrade, who I know through his writing and through the Haiti Solidarity Movement. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Drew. It's a pleasure to be here. Drew, I've been, I want to say this while I have your captive audience. I read all of your Facebook essays. Drew does these long researched, thoughtful Facebook essays. They're the best thing. They're probably the best thing on my Facebook feed. I would tell you to try to get them out more widely, but probably Facebook is as widely as anybody can get anything out these days.
That's the funny thing. I actually started posting them on a separate page just so that they would be on some other platform
Some
than
archive.
Facebook. But it really is the case that I don't think more people would read them if I put them anywhere else.
Yeah, weird.
But yeah, just to finish the intro, Justin is the author of several books, including Empire's Ally, Canada and the War in Afghanistan, also contributor to Real Utopia from AK Press, America's Wars on Democracy in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Extraordinary Threat, the US Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. So there's a whole bunch there, but I guess the reason I wanted to bring you on is because you've been doing this incredibly ambitious survey of basically world history for the last several hundred years. Reading
No,
in depth.
I've only been doing it for a year and a half. I haven't been doing it for a
Oh,
couple of
okay.
hundred years.
It's covering several hundred years. In any case, basically, I think I joined in on it on the starting with like the French and Haitian
Oh yeah.
revolutions, and then it's just kept going. And I haven't even gotten to the back what happened before that. But yeah, so can you, I guess, in the context of, we're here. It's been about a week since the U.S. decided to leave, or actually started to leave Afghanistan, and everything sort of fell apart there. Not that it wasn't falling apart for the previous 20 years, um, but so that, what is it like to read, to be sort of delving deep into the history of all these sort of colonial empires and revolutions and all kinds of things, and sort of see history happening in front of you? Like, how has that changed how you're seeing things?
Well, it's been great. In the sense that it's been great because I've seen the Afghanistan thing was amazing because there's just been a lot of things I wanted to read and that I put on the back burner, and then I decided to read for the purposes of this civilizations series that we were doing. And Afghanistan was always one of them. Anti-war activists for the past 20 years, we study a little bit of Afghanistan. Like everybody tries to get up to speed, as an activist. And I did that, but I learned a lot about Afghanistan in the intervening years, since then, about 70s Afghanistan and 60s Afghanistan, and then a lot of more detail of the war in the 80s. But I being able to go back and see what the British did, and almost more importantly what the British said, was really powerful, because you also realize how much of what people are saying now, in the media, politicians, is actually just repetitions of these things. Like people will quote Kipling, right? They'll start with this poem by Kipling, or they'll use the word like the Great Game, or they'll use the term graveyard of empires. These are all 19th century British phrases. So just being able to trace the language back is important, but then you also get a totally different picture of what is happening there and why, than you would if you start the clock later, which is what we're always encouraged to do. So
And what do you think it is about? I mean, even the people like in Afghanistan don't even know they're repeating things from like 150 years ago or whatever, right? So I'm just curious, like, is the intellectual basis of these sort of imperialist traditions so shallow and simple that it's just these simple formulations that keep happening over and over again, or what is it that makes it so repetitive?
that's a great question. I don't really think of it as a cycle as much as I think of it as just a long-term project that keeps unfolding. So one of the things that I learned doing the civilization series is like how much continuity there is between the US imperialism that everybody is living through now, the so-called neo-colonialism that we're all living through now, and the British Empire that preceded it. And all of the things that the British Empire, the creation of a world economy, the kinds of financial manipulations that they did, the kinds of suppression of the global labor, pool, to use kind of Marx's terms. It's all not everything. There are always innovations as time goes by, but there's so much that is common, and there's so much that imperial planners also can't invent things from whole cloth. Of course they go back to that literature, right? Of course they go back to those models. Like, if you're in 1919 and you're invading Afghanistan, you look at what happened in 1879. If you're doing it in 1879, you look at what they did in 1839. And similarly, if you're invading Afghanistan and running a covert operation against the government in the 70s, you look at what the British did and you call it that. You think of it as the Great Game, and you look up who the tribes are, and you look up that anthropology. So I don't know if I'd use the word shallow, and I don't actually think of it as repetitive. I guess I think of it as just different phases of an imperial project that continues to unfold, which is a little bit different. I mean, it's not entirely different from some damn thing, some kind of damn cycle like a Groundhog Day that we can't wake up from. Like there's some element, like I think of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right? His book "100 Years of Solitude," where it's like a small village in Colombia in the early 20th century, and the same shit just happens over and over again.
Right.
That's how history is in some ways. But I also think that one thing that is revealed when you study history, when you study imperial histories, especially from the 18th century on, is how much continuity, how it's a common playbook, and how it's common personnel and projects.
And so I think it must be fascinating. I mean, it has been fascinating sort of vicariously through your podcast to be able to go back in time and sort of be there when these things that we see all the time are invented, like the
Yeah.
modern state and so on. It and it's interesting how little has been invented sort of
Yeah.
since
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
But does going back to that moment give you a sense of greater as a leftist, I guess, coming like ideally wanting to work past capitalism?
Mhm.
um is there some insight that gives you to be in that moment where things are being invented, where it's like, oh well, this could also be a moment of invention, like
Exactly.
in terms of
Yeah.
the future?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's like you realize how many of these institutions have not been there forever, how much what people say is human nature or inevitable is actually the outcome of a specific system that was designed and implemented to benefit very specific parties, you know the British ruling class in most of the most of the period that we're talking about. And so there's a lot of historical inevitability. There's a lot of biological, this is just how people are, kinds of arguments that are not tenable when you understand history a little bit better, and when you know the details of where these institutions came from and why and who created them and who designed them. And it's also to understand pre-colonial societies, I think pre-colonial societies have gotten a really bad rap, because of the way history is. The ancient Klingon proverb, history is written by the victors, right? So because the imperialists are the ones who wrote about the societies they destroyed, they always presented it as we're destroying these oppressive societies. And in fact, there's just so much of history, so much in terms of institutions and ways that a society can live with an ecosystem, that we could learn from those societies if we could recover them. But of course, imperialism is very good at making it very hard to recover that knowledge and understand what happened and find out what happened in the past. So those are also insights from the study of history.
Yeah, and what does history teach you about sort of how we do those things, coexist with an ecological system on which we depend, treat each other, with minimal
Yeah.
decency, but in a highly technological, you know,
Yeah.
globally interconnected society? Like
It's weird
what's your
because
take on that
it's
in
weird
light of
because
history?
history is so bloody and so violent, and so there's so much death and mayhem and murder in this modern history that we cover, which basically we started the podcast in 1492, right? So it's been pretty bad in terms of for pre-colonial societies, all of which then eventually become colonized. And then towards the end of our series, some of them will slowly start to free themselves a little bit. And now here, that's where we are now in terms of the 500-year history. But as far as environment, I did my PhD in forestry. I teach at an environmental and urban change. That's the name of the faculty. It used to be environmental studies. So I'm very concerned with environmental questions. And another thing that the past year and a half of like really detailed historical study, it's actually made me more optimistic, because I believe now that the whole idea that the apocalypse is coming has always been one of these propaganda objects in history. For whatever reason, it's often religious. It's like, well, we're sinning, so the apocalypse is coming. And a lot of the language of the environmental movement just adopts this apocalyptic stuff. And some of the worst things in history were done by people who believed that the end of time was coming. Like Christopher Columbus apparently believed that the end of time was coming. If you look in David Stannard's book American Holocaust. So like I don't believe that anymore. Like I believe that society is gonna continue, and it's gonna struggle, and bad things will happen as they have happened, and people will make changes as they have made. And like as far as an apocalypse goes, like there was definitely an apocalypse in the Americas in the 15 and 1600s, right? And then in North America in the 16 and 1700s, like there was um the indigenous peoples of the Americas lost 90-95% of their people. um that was an apocalypse. I don't even know if the worst projections for climate change are that we would lose 90 to 95% of humanity. So some indigenous writers have said that. They've said like we've already lived through an apocalypse. So I just I where this historical study has taken me on the environment question is like we need to listen to indigenous people now and give as much land as possible back, as give as much land as we can grab back to those people. And like even if even if all of us are like half colonized, right? Like halfway colonized, including indigenous societies, like nobody's exempt from that. There's still whatever they have of indigenous culture, and that worldview is way advanced over what we have as far as a settler colonized society. So that's one insight, is like it's actually changed my worldview in terms of the apocalypticism. Another one, in terms of the possibilities of capitalism, transcending capitalism, is it's also got to do with how people responded to capitalism and the different phases of capitalism, right? So it's like there have always been uh, interventions by states into into the economy. Markets are set up, they're destroyed, they're replaced by planning. When you have a war, they're subsidized. Like the British, when the British were became the naval power that they became, they did it through a lot of state intervention. They were very careful about giving positions to, according to merit, which they weren't supposed to do. They were supposed to do it by noble birth, and they protected a lot. They protected the system to make sure that capitalism and feudalism didn't interfere with their ability to take over the world, because taking over the world is too important to leave to to the profit motive. um, and so whenever things are important enough, even uh, smart elites are willing to discard capitalism, at least for a while. And when the last thing that I see, that's kind of amazing, looking at like the decline of these empires. So it's like the decline of the Spanish Empire, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, even the decline of the British Empire. Towards the end, the elite is always unwilling to do the kinds of things that got them there in the first place. They're not willing to pay taxes anymore. They're not willing to make sacrifices anymore. They just want to grab everything they can. And there's often people that are kind of blowing the whistle and saying, look, you can't do this, like Thomas Frank. Listen, liberal, like, you can't just grab everything, because you actually need a certain degree of efficiency to continue to rule, continue your world domination program. And so it's a system that uh, has changed through time. It's a system that has been discarded at various moments when the stakes were too high. And so yeah, I don't think of it as I think of it as a lot less immutable or invincible than I did before.
Interesting. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on two really interesting threads. One is sort of indigeneity, and I guess so my understanding of why indigeneity is important, is I guess that we're talking about a society and a culture that's actually done this before.
Yeah.
That's like made the mistakes, like done ecological overreach, like
Right.
cut down too much firewood, or harvested too many plums, or whatever it was, and like paid the consequences probably
Yeah.
several times, and embedded those lessons in their culture. And
Right.
that's what makes them actually indigenous, is that they've embedded that relationship with a place and its limits in their way of being and their language. And then the other thing that I wanted to pick up on was smart elites, which seem to
Yeah.
be in short supply at the moment. um,
Yeah, most
but
of the time.
but yeah, I mean smart elites would do that. They'd be like, okay, well, we got to have capitalism, but
Yeah.
we gotta ease it down a notch while we deal with this climate thing, and then
Yeah.
we can go
Right.
bonkers again and start
So
exploiting everybody. but
yeah,
but yeah, so I mean,
that's great.
where are
Those
the
are
smart elites, and what do
I
you think of that definition of
that
indigeneity?
that's great, because I'm just we're researching the scramble for Africa over at Civilizations. Um and I have to read Lenin. So I'm reading like all these communist writers that when I was more anarchistically inclined, I would avoid these people. And I was like, oh, that's an authoritarian, take on things. And now I'm just like, well, I'm reading history. I have to read everybody. And this was a very influential text and a very influential person. And I'm not, I have a different take on, um, on politics now because of this, and it's like my attitude of like having to read everybody has actually changed my politics a little bit, I think. So I'm a little bit less I do a little bit less moralizing. I think this is what happens. I think a lot of people that are historians are a little bit less judgmental of historical figures and contemporary political figures. I think that's something that happens. Certainly happened to me. In any case, Lenin, um, I think the imperialism, the latest stage of capitalism, or that text, the thing that he does, which I think kind of brings your two threads together, is he argues that capitalism is a system that will not enable the smartest elites to make that kind of change. Like, so by the time he's writing, which is like 1916 or something, the scramble for Africa is deeply, like, it's more or less done. Every inch of Africa has been grabbed. You know, the World War I has already started, and he's just trying to explain like imperialism is not a policy. That's the whole point of that text. Is he's really angry at someone named Karl Kautsky. I don't know who this is yet. I don't know much about this person, but he's really angry at Kautsky, who's apparently a fake Marxist and misleading the masses, and a very bad person according to Lenin. But he seems to be saying that Kautsky thinks that imperialism is a policy. So elites have basically said, you know, this is a good policy. We're going to go and we're going to do these imperialist things. It's going to make us money. It's going to benefit the natives, whatever. And Lenin is saying, no, what's going on here is you've got a system where capitalism tends towards monopoly. So if you have competitive, like a system driven by competition, the winners will draw more resources to themselves, and they will eventually consolidate their control over markets and over the resources, and so on. And then there will only be a few of these, and they're called the monopolies or the trusts. And those trusts and those pools of capital now, which then are ultimately controlled by the financiers, the banks. So the banks exert this control by picking winners, by, you know, choosing which of these monopolies are going to win in the market, and then giving them more money. So if you're a medium-sized player and a bank won't finance you, you're not going to become a big player. And if you're not going to become a big player, you're going to become a non-player. You're out. And then it's going to be, the coal industry is going to be two or three players. Steel is going to be two or three. Rail is going to be two or three. So there's this tendency towards monopoly, driven by the dynamics of competition and the dynamics of finance. And then if you're a capitalist now, or if you're even a state that's running one of these capitalist, you know, one of these powerful monopoly based capitalistic states, which is like only a few. There's France, Germany, US, and Britain. At that time, like, there's only a few powers, really. And like, for his purposes, it's basically France and the UK, and Germany, UK, and US. And everybody, France and Russia, are well behind. But in any case, um, if you have a choice between a highly profitable investment and a lower profit investment, you have to choose the high profit investment, because if you don't, then someone else will, and then eventually you will be outcompeted and disappear. So the high profit investments are in the colonies. So that's how the scramble for colonies happens, because everybody has to go to these high profit enterprises, which are, by putting a little bit of capital in, you get a huge profit, because right now it's like wages are so low and there's so little development. So there's this scramble for these colonies, and then eventually the world is full. We're all full up. There's nothing more to grab. And then they start to fight each other. And that was, how he analyzed World War I. And W.E.B. Du Bois said something similar. So all of this is to say, really smart elites can choose policies, but they can't, the only way to change a whole system has traditionally been through some kind of revolution. So that was why Lenin's conclusion was, there's no way to have good, smart capitalists decide on an anti-imperialist policy. They can't do it. They're bound by these dynamics to continue to do what they're doing. And so there's an element of that in everything that we analyze today in the situation of neocolonialism. So it's I think that's also why the idea of the smart elites are in short supply, because they they can't they can't structurally think of the climate or
Right.
going off of fossil fuels.
Yeah, I feel like this brings us back to I guess how we know each other, which is the sort of like very concrete sort of anti-imperialist like work in Canada. Like, let's try to stop or at least curb the worst excesses of Canada's occupation of Haiti, or our invasion of Afghanistan, or whatever it is. And I'm and it feels like, there's sort of a sadness in the way that these corporate media outlets just repeat the same things over and over again in complete willful ignorance of any kind of factual basis for what they're doing. And in Haiti, what was remarkable is that they didn't even try to make the argument. They just stopped talking about it, basically. But yeah, I guess because they didn't feel like they had to. But it's interesting, just these disempowered people who can't even imagine anything else, and so why even bother talking about it?
Yeah. But you got it. But yeah, here's another thing you get from the study of history, which is like, I always read these, like, Marx's criticisms of the Opium War were incredible. His criticisms of the 1857 and what the British did in India in 1857 were amazing. And so, like, he didn't stop imperialism, but he certainly, that's the person you want to read, right? And now in this period, there's like Lenin, and there's other anti-imperialists, and so if you're going back through the history, it's like, oh yeah, I want to be, I want to be at least, somebody in the future could read this and say, okay, well, that makes more sense than this crap that, that the imperialists were writing at the time.
And so is there part of you that's sort of because I feel like we're both kind of coming from an anarchist background, but I certainly have moved a lot into the world of like, okay, I can understand at least. I mean, I'm not going to agree with every decision, that someone like Lenin made, but I can understand the rationale behind it, which is like, we're not in it to be moral in the short term. Exactly. We're in it to confront this global system and tilt the scales so that things are fundamentally better long term, which of course did not come to pass. But
yeah, and I mean,
or did it? I don't know. I mean, clearly not in the way that he had in mind, anyway.
Well, I don't know. I mean, what he was looking at is, as far as what Russia was when he got there and what it is now, or even what it was when the Soviet Union fell, it was different. And it was nobody's colony, right? Like, it was a neo colony for a few years under Yeltsin, but right now, like, you're right, it's not a utopia, but it's also it's not even a neo colony, right? Like, it's its own thing. It's and I guess this is where we could talk about nationalism, right? Because
that was definitely another thing that I wanted to pick up on, and I guess the kind of contradiction of it, from my perspective anyway, I'm curious what you think, but is that nationalism is this incredible engine that modernizes Europe, that creates the nation state, and surpasses the sort of aristocracy, and becomes the sort of social cohesion mechanism by which these modernizing technologizing states develop capitalism, and become these sort of imperial powers. But at the same time, it's it's also the engine of liberation movements, whether you're talking about India or Afghanistan or China. Like creating that national identity is the thing that pushes back against empire as well, and maybe creates new sort of regional fiefdoms or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, how do you sort of approach that
Yeah,
tension?
I guess what I'm working on now is like a total distinction between anti-colonial and colonial nationalisms, because even like the way I think about it now is like even when you take some place like India, which is the outcome of, to some degree it's the outcome of a struggle, and to some degree it's the outcome of like a very controlled partition by the British Empire. um, and and the state of India today, which I'd call like a fascist stooge, like imperialist stooge. I don't think it's I don't think it's entirely coincidental, because it's like in some ways an underdeveloped nationalism. It's an underdeveloped anti-colonial nationalism, and so it's got this sort of Hindu, religious nationalism that's like defines an internal enemy, like the Muslim communities, the problem. And they go back over history. They have a whole different reading of history, which is, not not sound from my perspective, historically. But it's like, and the same goes for like whether it's Canadian or Australian or New Zealand or any of the US, like all of these settler colonies, their nationalisms I don't think of as, I don't think of them as analogous to, like I really think of them as two different things when you're talking about that versus like the nationalisms of, the Congolese or the Afghans or or the Chinese, or any of these former colonies or semi-colonies. So where does that leave us? I guess from my perspective, it's like, again, I'm a little bit less I'm a little bit more patient, I guess, with third world nationalism and with the attempts of third world nation states to develop independently than I would have been if I was just like, if I took a kind of an abstract perspective that nationalism is bad, along, nationalism and capitalism are twin evils or something. So for me, what the way my reading of history now is that like nationalism is the force that achieved decolonization, to the extent that we had a decolonization or a partial decolonization in the 40s and 50s and 60s in Asia and Africa, is because of nationalism. And then, because of support from the Soviet Union is also another important element of it. So these are all like very challenging beliefs to someone who's like, all like fully libertarian. If you've got like a completely libertarian, like free association is the ideal, but like where in a world of like a single empire that's out to destroy every form of organized society, um yeah, I think you have to be a bit more patient with some of these configurations and historical situations.
On the other hand, you have this like rich tradition of internationalism, which comes
Yeah.
out, that especially in Europe, where people like Lenin, I mean, obviously not just him, but like were actually advocating that their countries would like lose wars,
Yeah.
or like,
Yeah. There are
you know,
Italians too in Abyssinia who are saying we really defeatists. Yeah.
yeah, and on the basis of this common humanity, basically, with people who
Yeah.
don't speak the same language, don't look different, etc., etc., etc. And
But they
so
were also very good on the national question. So
yeah,
like Lenin,
yeah.
Marx, they were all very, very much also that like their belief was that the basis of their internationalism was also the self-determination of, uh, the colonized peoples, basically.
Right. And I guess you certainly see that in Cuba, where like you have a
Yeah.
revolution that was completely fueled by nationalism, but on the other hand,
Yeah.
takes on these like absurdly you know, lopsided sort of military,
Yeah.
you know, goals of like liberating Africa using like troops on the ground with Fidel
I,
Castro, like, you know, commanding them by telephone or whatever. But
I talked to a veteran of the Angola intervention. Apparently, that was the biggest crossing of of troops of the across the Atlantic since World War II. So there.
yeah. So in conclusion, they can coexist. Having sort of read through this, you know, really surveyed like these historical situations, like what's your prognosis on creating alternatives inside, you know, inside the empire or inside within capitalism, or transforming it from
Mm.
within? You know, like it seems like the revolutionary model of like seizing state power and then sparking some kind of global revolution is mostly off the table at the moment. um,
Well,
but at the same time,
it's never on the table until it's on the table.
these things do tend to change in a hurry. But I mean,
Yeah,
you know, very few people are even you know, advocating for it, to think of it as on the table or
yeah, for sure.
potentially being on the table. But yeah, tell me what you think of that.
I think um I think even if you're talking about North America or Australia or New Zealand, whatever, like where we're these settler colonies where we are, I actually think the most strategic anti-capitalist thing is support for indigenous movements. And you know, in the US, I mean here too, but like also African, you know, there's a book called Settlers by Sakai. I don't know, I recommend that one. It's like a good one to read alongside Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. It kind of covers the same one, but Sakai's analysis is of the Black population in the US as an internal colony, which is also like George Jackson, the Black Panthers had some of that analysis as well. So it's like there's also a thing to do. There's also a task of decolonization in these settler colonies, right? In terms of support for indigenous land back. And I think that's the most important project. So when it comes to other, like, you know, whether it's Asia or Africa or the Middle East or Latin America, I mean, Latin America also, they'll have to change their relationship with indigenous people. But you know, Bolivia, Guatemala, they're ahead of that. You know, they're ahead of the curve. They're well ahead of what anything we have in North America in that way, right? Like just demographically um, in terms of like having been president of the whole country in Bolivia's case. But with I guess for me, like the strategic imperative is decolonization, and it's like I think those efforts are um, the most important thing to do everywhere. So like uh to go back to like Lenin, I haven't studied like State and Revolution or What Is to Be Done yet. I know those texts are on the table when I go to the Russian Revolution, but I have a feeling, because the way I've been reading all of these things is I try to read them in the context that they were written. So like I was reading Marx surrounded by the historical events that Marx was writing about. And I think when Lenin was writing about, when he was writing those texts, he was writing like a manual for what they were trying to do in Russia at that time. So like there may be general lessons to be learned. I'm sure there are, but like you don't want to overstate how much something from one context can be done in another. Like there's also a reason, you know, there's a reason that model wasn't proposed for a place like Canada or the US, right? It's gonna have to be, it would have to be something different.
um, so yeah, I guess, can you unpack a little more why you think decolonization is the most important thing in terms of like, does it just go back to the relationship to ecology,
No.
or what else is in there?
So I was just saying, well, I was just saying how you don't want to generalize, but like that, the idea of imperialism and the idea of colonialism in terms of like what, let's take Canada. What is the Canadian state's like project? And if you look at it at its core, it's basically about taking land, extracting resources, um, and and doing, and doing that for the world market in the most, and right now specializing in mining, but like the particular specialty can always change. So I don't know, again, like my historical study has actually led me away from like the idea that Iraq is about oil and Bolivia is about lithium and Canada is about mines and whatever. Like the particular resources are less important than the relationship of domination and exploitation of imperialism. The resources can change, but um, Canada is this project of like from from the 19th century to today. It's like expanding into all these lands incredibly rapidly, seizing these indigenous lands, and then doing various things with them, turning them into profit, um, and at the in destroying the ecology and the societies of these territories. So it's like if you're trying to build an anti-capitalist project in the in among the within the kind of stratum that's being sold these resources, or having these resources appropriated to them, that's the critique, that's the anti-imperialist critique of what they call the social imperialists, right? Like socialists who are imperialists, socialists who say like, we don't care about stealing indigenous land, we just want to make sure that what we steal is equitably distributed among all the settlers. And so, and like that's also Lenin's critique of what he calls the labor aristocracy, right? He's like, why don't the Europeans, the Western Europeans and the Americans, why don't they oppose imperialism more? Well, because when they fight for their rights inside these imperial contexts, the capitalists have enough surplus. They've stolen enough surplus from the world to be able to give them something. And so most of these gains that the workers make in the late 19th century and early 20th century, these socialist movements that are imperialist as well, they make in the context of resources that are available because of imperialism. And so the capitalists are thinking, okay, if I give this group a little bit more, then I can continue to plunder and they won't. But if we turn them into if we proletarianize the working class of North America and Western Europe and like dump their wages down to third world levels, they'll fight us just as hard as anybody, and then it'll be like a problem of control everywhere. So that's why. So the reason why all like the anti-colonial struggle is always the more strategic struggle is because that is the basis for the system. Like you've probably seen those memes of like people holding up, like it's usually like, I think it's from World War I. It's like all these World War I soldiers and they're all getting shot and dying and they're holding up thing, and there's like this idyllic scene of like people playing at a park or whatever, a family, and there's different things people do with it. The one I've seen is like people who make YouTube instructionals and they're the ones holding up the world for I'll have to send you the graphic, but anyway, the point is that if that's the basis that's like holding up the sky for everyone, then that's where um that's where you have to make a change if you want to change the system.
So, I mean, I certainly agree with that. And I think that's been the focus of my sort of political activism for decades. But I guess the process that I went through is I realized that, in trying to oppose, the empire, or in any particular instance of imperialism, whether it's the occupation of Haiti or Afghanistan, or
Mhm.
the continued theft and pillage of indigenous lands. um, like you always sort of run in, or I would always run into the same thing, which is that I inevitably end up trying to sort of mobilize the resources of this dwindling social democratic infrastructure,
Yeah.
whether it's unions or civil society groups, and trying to like convince the people in those places which are on the decline, really having watched it over a few decades, is like very dramatic decline,
Yeah.
in terms of like the shredding of the social fabric, that sort of held everything together, that got us
Yeah.
some of the sort of gains that one can point to, like Medicare or
Yeah.
whatever else. um, but trying to mobilize those forces and sort of realizing that without that network of people, at least ostensibly starting from a point of operating in their self-interest, and the self-interest can obviously be defined in different ways, whether it's being less alienated, or just being living in reality, or whatever it is. But nonetheless, you need this sort of social fabric in order to have the social forces necessary to confront imperialism properly, or so you don't just so you go from where we are, which is like, oh yeah, we can get a few hundred anti-imperialists in the street for this
Yeah.
or that, but we know that doesn't do anything. Like, and
Yeah.
so how do we get to the point where, I mean, I'm not going to say it doesn't do anything, but it doesn't do nearly what the task requires.
Yeah.
So it seems like, um, coming from it from a sort of, seeing the rise of Bernie Sanders and being like, okay, well, we need to do that kind of thing, where it's like, okay, let's address people's day-to-day lived experience, but at the same time infuse it with this bigger reality of like what is actually going on in the world. And that seems to be very, I mean, I'm tentative on it, but that does seem to be happening. Like there does seem to be an decolonial infused
Yeah.
social democracy that's sort of developing.
Yeah. Again, I think there are possibilities now that weren't before. Like, I think you can talk about it in a way, like, and I think in this case it's because of what Indigenous people in Canada in this context have done in recent decades, right?
yeah,
Like it's the things I know from reading, Arthur Manuel and Leanne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard. It's like that was like way beyond what I understood, 20 years ago as an anti-war person, like about Canada.
absolutely. And I guess what I would take from what you're saying is like, yes, we do need to create those sort of nominally self-interested movements, but at the same time infuse them with that sort of understanding. And I mean, I feel like there is a moment at which point it has to be sort of about like, actually no, we don't get as many treats because those
Yeah,
are
but
they're
you know
coming
what?
from they're
Yeah,
coming from stolen land, or they're coming from hyper exploited global south or whatever.
it's true, but even though, like, it's true, but it's not like you don't get the treat. It's just that you may not have, like, you're not going to have a 20-cent banana. You might have a $10 banana or something. Like, it's not that you'll, because the networks exist, the exchanges exist. It's just that the prices are depressed because the wages are depressed. Like, the whole system works on this in this way. But like, it could still work. I think it would be better, right? Like, we really do believe, like, anti-capitalists, socialists or communists or whatever, we do believe that the world would be better.
Mhm.
um and in a lot of ways, even in terms of consumption, like, not you'd be consuming a lot less of some stuff, but like, there's a lot of things that capitalists do now to to inflate consumption, right? Like, like, food is processed so much to try to add value added and try to use raw materials that are artificially cheap and then make them higher priced. So there's like a lot of games that are played, and then
Yeah.
you're not consuming enough healthcare, and you're
Planned
not
obsolescence and all this stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Um, so I guess sort of coming back to that, the core of what you're saying about decolonization being the most important is just acknowledging the sort of Indigenous activism in Canada, for example, as the sort of as the engine of that decolonization. So that would be the reason to continually sort of center that, is that it keeps us rooted in reality in a way,
Yeah, reality,
in our
the
struggles.
reality of
Yeah.
what this country is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, the reality of what this country is in this territory, and also the reality of what this country is in the world, like the role
Mm-hmm.
that the country plays in the world. Yeah, exactly.
Um, and what have you found? I mean, so to me, that like the Indigenous, dealing with sort of Indigenous movements here has to the extent that those that Indigenous people, or some fraction of Indigenous people, are like highly mobilized and really fighting for
Mm-hmm.
basic justice. It seems to have had a profound effect in the last like 10 to 15 years, in my experience.
Yeah.
But it seems much harder to do that on the international level, and Canada is obviously like um, creating a lot of havoc and deriving a lot of its wealth from the exploitation of people abroad, and so um, and lands abroad, outside of our borders anyway. So yeah, I guess what lessons have you learned sort of in your decades of trying to trying to bridge that gap and get the information out?
Yeah, that's, I guess there's a lesson, there's an insight that I'm just trying to work towards now, which is like I write a book every few years about a different part of the world, but I'm writing the same book over and over again. And so there's a question of like, what is the pattern that I'm writing about, that I keep writing about, but how can I express this so that I'm not just continuously debunking new lies according to a pattern, and then every time they make up a lie, I have to go and debunk it, and okay, look, I wrote a book saying they weren't in Haiti for good reasons, and then I wrote a chapter in a book saying they weren't in Afghanistan for good reasons, and then I wrote a book about Congo, and now I've written a book about Venezuela with Joe Emmersberger, and it's like, what am I just going to keep doing this? Do I just keep doing this, or is there some way to which is part of, again, like, this is part of my motivation for studying history, is like, um what are these recurring patterns? How could we describe these? And like, how could I write a book that a reader, however many hundred readers I happen to have, can then use that book and identify the next ones and be like, no, 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 I'm not gonna fall for that. Because that's like, um I think that from the imperialist standpoint, it is strategic. They don't necessarily need that many people to be pro imperialist, but they certainly do need some. Otherwise, they wouldn't have this intensity of pro-war propaganda, right? It's too pervasive, and it's been too pervasive for too long for it to be something that isn't important to them. So it's always going to be important for us to try to reduce the level of racism in this country towards the people of the world, um, and including the victims of whatever imperial intervention is happening. Uh, but yeah, it's not going to be. I don't think it's ever going to be an easy thing, or like, it's always going to be an uphill propaganda battle. There'll be periods when people are more or less interested, um, depending on what's happening. There'll be openings, But here's another historical movement like Marcus Garvey, right? Like the Marcus Garvey was organizing. I haven't gotten there in Civilizations, but I've been reading them. I read a little bit ahead. I try to read a few decades ahead. But Marcus Garvey was organizing. He's like one of the precursors to Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was reading W.E.B. Du Bois, and he's reading Marcus Garvey. And Garvey was like, writing in the 20s, 30s. So it's like KKK, lynchings. It's not a high point. It's a very, very low point for Black people in the U.S. The Caribbean are colonies. So his whole thing is like preparation. So he has like education and preparation. He's like, we may not be able to actually do anything for a while. But you've got to get ready. You've got to work on your knowledge of Africa and like how Africa is actually great, and it's not this hopeless, backward, eternal country of slaves and servants. You've got to learn how to organize. You've got to. So that's his thing. He's just like in periods where things are not. There are very few openings. It's important to prepare in terms of education, and that's another reason. Like it's one of those things. Like none of us have gone to a political meeting in a year and a half because of the pandemic, and that was another thing. I was like, well, I have to do something. Maybe we can do this podcast and go back over history and like have a much deeper analysis than we usually have of things.
And so what do you think, for I don't know, let's say North American, US or Canadian, settler activists, what do you think the preparation consists of? Like what would that, because clearly we're on the edge of potential breakthroughs, but those breakthroughs would just lead to more like doors slammed in our face. So on like if Bernie Sanders had gotten nominated, like the onslaught after
well,
that would have
what
been
I mean,
like
the January 6th thing
yeah,
would have been a when you think if they
it
were
would have been
willing to
backed by
do
the
that.
New York Times.
Yeah, if they were willing to do that to Biden, like that was my thought. That
Yeah,
January 6th thing, I was like, wow, if Bernie had won, this would
yeah.
have been, there would have
Yeah,
been tanks there.
totally.
So
But that said, like, in what does the preparation consist? In light of your comments on sort of centering decolonization and so on.
listening to podcasts.
Yeah, listen to Justin's podcast. That's your
No.
preparation.
No, but those are important activities too, right? Like I'm kind of doing it for myself. People always say that, but it's like I am going over history in a way that I've always wanted to do. And so like and I've wanted to do it for to be a knowledgeable person, but also like for political reasons, because I wanted to know like what revolutionaries have done and where they've succeeded or failed. It's kind of like what you were saying about learning to live within limits or whatever, right? Like the iterations. You can't. Revolution is fairly unforgiving. Like you don't get the same person trying it multiple times. So it's very important to study history. And I think for me, like it doesn't all boil down to propaganda, but and everything before the but is rendered what do they say in Game of Thrones? Everything you say before the but is canceled by the but. But there's so much propaganda that unless you've studied a specific thing in detail, you probably what you believe about it is probably the propaganda. So when it comes to left history, revolutions, third world governments or movements, you have absorbed so much propaganda. You've absorbed more propaganda than you possibly know. And so that's preparation for me, is like learning to ask, like, are you sure? Like North Korea has been one of those for me in the past year and a half. Like North Korea, it's like you just say North Korea and people laugh. People are just like, North Korea, that's so funny. That guy and his haircut or whatever. But like almost everything you know about North Korea is filtered through South Korea, which is like a US military base, and like an operation to try to overthrow the country. So like I had this moment where I was like, wow, I actually know nothing about North Korea. Like, I know nothing authentic about North Korea. Everything that I know is propaganda. And then go back and like think about what else you've thought or said. And then when the next, that's the important thing, is like when the next war happens or when the next situation happens and you're told these things, like, do I really know those things?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I guess just on the podcast angle, it's been pretty wild because at the same time I've been listening to Civilizations, your thing with Dave. I've also listened to The Age of Napoleon, which did a whole series, well, about the French Revolution, obviously, but also did a whole series on the Haitian Revolution. And then the Revolutions podcast, which did a whole season on the Haitian Revolution and a whole season on the French Revolution. It's almost like this embarrassment of riches. I mean, I never listened to podcasts before I was a parent, but all of a sudden now
Yeah, well, you're putting them in bed. What else can you do? You're waiting for them to fall asleep. That's when I listened to a lot of the Radio War Nerd while I was waiting for my kid to fall asleep.
yeah. um so it's just, yeah, it's interesting how there's just I can these things that I would have had to like delve into books on
Yeah,
dusty shelves at this point are just within a few button clicks, and I
right.
can like listen to these really sophisticated and varying
Yeah,
takes on them. But that's more of an aside. But I guess, in terms of the studying thing, I certainly agree with everything you've been saying. But I guess one thing I would add, and I'm curious what your response would be, is that we need to learn how to be
yeah,
in organizations
yeah, for sure,
together. Like, we need to
for sure.
like because
Absolutely.
that's a whole thing that's been stripped out of our culture, is like how to be in an organization. Right now we know
Absolutely.
how to be we know how to have like staff driven NGOs where they send you something to click on every once in a while, or like
Yeah,
donate. But we don't know how to like make decisions democratically and then abide by them,
yeah,
or like subordinate some like a little tiny
yeah.
part of our own activity, 15 minutes a week or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
to some kind of collective goal where we're like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't quite agree with exactly how this happened, but I'm still going to do it because that's
Mm-hmm.
just what we do, and that's how we create collective power.
Yeah, I
But
mean,
that
most people are doing that all day. Like, this is the reason imperialism works, is because most of us work for the imperialists most of the time, and it's like,
Absolutely, yeah.
we're activists as a hobby, and we're like day job is for the imperialists. It's like, and when a revolution is basically when all the people that are working for the imperialists start working, a critical mass of them start working for you instead of them, and then they lose. And that's pretty much it. Like, um, so yeah, I totally agree with you, and I that's why I like your emphasis on co-ops and like organizations and collective work. Um, yeah, I think that's a great. When I heard about this podcast, I thought that was a great thing to do in a conscious way, like to have a podcast about where you're actually studying it and talking about it and thinking about it, as opposed to like, hey, let's do a co-op, and then you repeat, presumably. I've never been in a co-op, but like presumably you just end up repeating. I can't imagine anything happening except you repeat the same damn thing uh, that has happened every time, every dysfunctional previous co-op has done.
There are certainly some patterns that can be identified. But yeah, I mean, since we're here on the topic, what is your take on cooperatives? It's sometimes a little controversial on the left, but I'm curious how you orient toward them.
Well, I mean, I think there's a range of forms, but like in terms whether it's like profit sharing or it's decision making sharing. I think it's great. Like I think it's exactly like you say. Like you have to figure out how to get work done and to honor every member, and to fulfill the democratic ideal while you're doing it. I think that's a important, and it's something you can only do by doing it. So like I work at this bureaucracy at York University, but it's like there's a senate and there's all these formal, there's collective bargaining, there's unions, there's contracts, but it's like it's not a democracy. That's for sure. But there are these elements of formalized, almost like a republican model, because there's a senate, and the senate is supposed to have the collective senate is supposed to have final say over everything to do with academic matters. And then there's always these conflicts that arise, right? And then within the union's also supposed to be a democratic organization, but then there's like layers of privilege because there's different unions for different categories of job at the university. So yeah, I mean, if you have the opportunity to start an organization from scratch, I would want to know how that was done. I would want to know, historically, I would be like, okay, who's done this? What have they learned? What do we need to do? And what do we need to not do?
And is that something you've come across in your readings of history, whether in the South, as it were, or otherwise?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's I guess from the Anglo tradition, there's all these social, like the Robert Owen socialists, right? They were doing all of this kind of stuff. Um, and then I mean, the Russian Revolution. There will be lots to talk about in those terms. I like the Haitian Revolution. The revolutionaries re-centralized everything, right? So, and I think that's more or less what the Russians did too, because there's always this: you have a revolution and then you have a war to fight with the imperialists because they're trying to crush you. And so there's this inevitable like centralization that has to happen just defensively, where you need this total central planning to get the war economy working. So the Haitians did that. I think the French did that. I don't know as much about the French. The Russians certainly did that. Um, the Chinese did that. So, uh, but like after, if you're outside of a war context, whether it's before or after, is the time to experiment with these things. And I think, I think that it's, um, I think that there are experiences uh, that I don't know much more about than, like, obviously there's like ones from, the English ones I know about. There's Spain. There's like Mondragon, right? Um, which is in.
I guess you haven't done the Spanish Civil War yet,
No, that's gonna be a doozy.
because they had these wild structures where they
Yeah,
had like
exactly.
assemblies based on the industry you were in,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had a whole layer of assemblies about that. But then they also had assemblies based on the locality you're in. So they had this sort of like um, overlapping sort of lattice work of
Mm-hmm.
assemblies, basically running through the economic and community lives of people. That was pretty fascinating. But they
Yeah.
actually did that during the war, which I don't know, I found sort of unfathomable, and maybe speaks to why it didn't work out.
Well, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I will look. I don't think, I can't imagine cooperatives are why they lost. I mean, I don't think they
Well,
were
not
that great on
cooperatives,
the
but an excess of democracy, maybe.
yeah, maybe. I think it was like uh yeah, I don't know. My hypothesis is that there was colonialism had something to do with it, right? Like I think Franco was able to bring a lot of North African troops. I wonder if I think there was like some proposal to undercut him by declaring independent, by basically saying
Right, right, right,
Morocco
right.
would be independent, but I don't think they did that. So that might have been a blind. Well, we'll see. I'll see. but I will look into this.
to be determined. But I, in any case, I really liked your the insight of like, okay, when the empire like stomps on you with its giant boot, like that is not the moment to experiment with, you know,
Yeah. Okay.
nice decentralized,
Yeah.
cooperative models, but like maybe before that and after that, assuming you're
Yeah.
successful with the,
Yeah. Yeah, because
repelling
yeah,
the boot.
exactly. Because it's like yeah, you don't need, nobody needs that. And I've heard, again, I'm gonna have to study this more, but I've heard that part of the reason the Soviet Union failed actually was because they kind of got stuck at that level of like planning, and people, they were so successful at achieving like that level of development for people that the people also expected more, and they expected like, you know, more diverse offerings and more workplace control and like all these nice things that you think of co-ops as providing, but they couldn't, like the system couldn't adapt to that in the 80s. So
And then in Yugoslavia, this is
yeah, Yugoslavia is a great co-op place, isn't
well,
it?
I mean, it is, and it. I mean, I'm interested to delve more into the history because
Yeah.
my understanding of it is that yes, like they absolutely had some like really groundbreaking workplace democracy sort of
Yeah.
initiatives, but also those workplace democracy sort of assemblies or whatever they are became sort of hotbeds of regional linguistic nationalism,
Oh, interesting.
which of course undermined the federated nature of the socialist project they were trying to build.
Hmm.
So, um,
Well, that would surprise
so
me.
that's tricky,
That
right?
yeah, that would surprise me though, because you know, I blame my other crude thing is like I blame
Mm.
imperialism for everything. So my active hypothesis about Yugoslavia is it would have been fine if it weren't for like the deliberate NATO program to break it up um, after, you know, in the 90s or whatever.
Yeah, my sense is that there was the regional nationalism could have gone in any number of
Yeah,
directions, but it
exactly.
went in the direction it did because the
Like there
IMF
were,
the IMF pulled the plug on the country's
yeah,
economy, basically. Yeah,
the IMF, like they had conditionalities like you can't do business with the other ethnicity. Like they were
right.
trying to break the country
Yeah,
up, right?
yeah.
So okay,
Well,
well,
thanks so much, Justin. Thanks so much for coming on. I appreciate. Do you wanna plug your stuff real quick?
oh yeah, you know, you can find me on Twitter or Justin Podur or you know, I wrote a novel. I wrote a thriller, you guys. Everybody wants to sell their novel. Like nobody wants to. So I wrote a thriller about Gaza called Siege Breakers. So read that if you want to like do anything. But yeah,
So it's like
thanks.
here's my SoundCloud for
Yeah.
anti-imperialist writers.
Exactly. This really blew up, guys. Here's my GoFundMe. No, but yeah, thank you, Drew. This was, you know, I like I said, I follow your essays, and I was really happy to see this podcast, and I'm really pleased to be on it. So thanks for inviting me.